Well, thank you very much, Mitchell Garabedian, for coming on the podcast for Objections. Just want to start out broadly. We are approaching the 20th anniversary of the Boston Globe Spotlight investigation. What was your view of that investigation's impact on accountability for clergy abuse?
The investigation had a tremendous impact in helping notify the public that they have to protect children where those children are in the caring custody of priests. And it had great impact in helping clergy sexual abuse victims or survivors try to heal and come forward and report the abuse. With a clergy sexual abuse survivor or victim, it's all about validation. The survivor or victim has to know that the abuse was not their fault. And when you have a report, when you have the investigation, when you have the spotlight team working as diligently as it did, it provides hope to those victims and survivors that they can report their abuse and they will be believed.
Do you remember what it was like when the series came out?
Well, I was working 18 hours a day, 16 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. It was a tidal wave of survivors or victims coming forward, reporting the abuse, saying, "Hey, me too. I finally found somebody who will believe me. I was not the only one, and it's a relief to me." Many victims or survivors say that to themselves.
And here we are some 20 years later, and the issue is still heating up. Just recently, I know that you can't speak specifically about some of these cases, but there is a prosecution coming up of Cardinal McCarrick, and that is the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church to be prosecuted for allegations against him. What does it say generally that 2 decades later, that talk of accountability is still on the horizon?
The depth and scope of the clergy sexual abuse crisis is enormous. I mean, here we are 20 years later. Civil suits are being filed. Statute of limitations are being amended. Criminal cases are being filed against high-ranking church officials worldwide. It just is simply amazing that the Catholic Church was involved in such criminality and cover-up of those crimes for decades upon decades upon decades. It speaks for itself. Here we are, it's 2021, and victims are pouring into my office and they're coming forward worldwide, reporting these crimes of clergy sexual abuse and the cover-up by church officials.
And you were obviously portrayed by Stanley Tucci in a film dramatization of the Boston Globe Spotlight team's investigation. What was that experience like?
Well, I thought the movie itself sent tremendously positive messages to victims and survivors and the public. But the use should be reported, that victims and survivors can try to heal, and that the public, again, has to watch their children when they're in the care and custody of priests. I mean, a great message by Spotlight was, you're not alone. You're not the only victim. And you should be proud of yourself, gain validation, try to heal, try to move on with your life. And there are many supporters of victims of clergy sexual abuse or survivors of clergy sexual abuse.
Were you consulted in the making of that film? And if so, what was that process like?
I was not consulted. I read about it in a newspaper. Years earlier, Ted Danson portrayed me in the movie Our Fathers, which was on Showtime for a few years. And that got excellent reviews too. And so just as in that movie, I was not consulted, but it was an honor to be portrayed by Stanley Tucci, who I thought did a great job in his acting. And I thought every actor in the movie, and I've met them, many actors in the movie, and it was a labor of love for them. They really wanted to do this movie and they poured their hearts into it and their talents, and it came out extremely well. It's a voice. It's a voice for those who didn't have a voice. And it still is. And I still get calls because of that movie from victims or survivors who want to now come forward because they've watched it for the 5th time or the 8th time or the 10th time. And they finally have gained the courage to come forward.
And you mentioned earlier, statute of limitations have been amended. Just in, I'm in New York right now, and New York had extended the statute of limitations with the New York Child Victims Act. Has this, in your experience, expanded the possibility for accountability? Are state legislatures, in doing these actions, giving rise to new avenues of accountability for clergy sexual abuse?
Oh, without a doubt. The amendment of statute of limitations is helping clergy sexual abuse victims or survivors come forward, report their abuse, and gain a degree of justice, which leads to validation, which leads to healing. It's so very important. I'm often told, well, individuals often commented, well, the cases are so old, how can the defendant properly defend himself or herself? Well, my answer to that is in murder cases, there's no statute of limitations, and due process and works fine in those cases. So due process will work fine in these civil cases or criminal cases.
Is there any disappointment that it has taken so long? Again, going back to, it's been 2 decades now, and some of the most high-profile cases are just being brought forward.
There's always disappointment with survivors or victims because they want to feel counted. They want to, as I use the term, validated. They want to try to heal, and they don't want to be left out of the process any longer. When a victim is survivor sexually abused by a priest, so often they don't feel that sense of being anymore, that sense of connection with the church, that sense of connection with God, that sense of connection with the community of the church. So when there's a funeral, they'll wait outside on the stairs. Or when there's a wedding, they wait outside on the stairs. They don't feel connected. It's all about validation. It's about trying to make a survivor or victim feel at least, feel whole.
And in that process of trying to make a survivor of abuse feel whole, are there any kind of memories in your advocacy of these issues, of a moment that was a breakthrough moment that kind of shows why you do this work?
Can you rephrase that? I don't quite understand.
Yeah, I mean, is there any particular moment where there was a breakthrough in a case that you were pursuing that where a survivor really felt that sense of validation because of the work and because of the attention being called?
So often, and I've been representing victims of clergy sexual abuse or survivors of clergy sexual abuse for decades. So often, I'll be told in the first phone call or the second phone call, I finally found someone who believes me. I finally found someone who I think I can trust. I finally found someone who's going to support me and represent me. It's been an enormous amount of times where I've been told, you're the first person I've told, and because I felt as though you believe me and you do believe me, thank you. And that starts the process. That's the process of healing. That's the process of gaining at least a degree of closure. That's the process of gaining a degree of validation. It's so important. Often I'll get a call from a survivor or victim, and then they won't come forward. They just want to tell me about the abuse. And then I'll get a call maybe a year later, 5 years later, they'll make the second call, and they will have garnered the strength to come forward. A man recently called me, and he heard I had passed away. And he said, I was abused, and I was abused by this priest, and I'm not ready to come forward yet, but I wanted to make sure you hadn't passed away because I want to come forward. I want to report my abuse as soon as I can gain the strength, as soon as I can get the level of strength to come forward. It takes an enormous amount of time for a person to come forward because they have to be able to cope with coming forward, cope emotionally. And that's why you see many survivors of victims coming forward when they're at least 45, 50, 55 years old, or well into their 80s, because their coping mechanisms then allow them to come forward. If they come forward too soon, they end up cutting themselves or self-mutilating or just not being able to handle it emotionally.
One of the things you just said reminds to me, I'm a big Mark Twain fan. There's a Mark Twain quote, "The report of my death was an exaggeration," to kind of pivot from that as years pass, as decades pass, is a challenge going forward that we are finding some of the accused wrongdoers retiring or passing away, as the case may be. What are some of the biggest goals and challenges for accountability going forward?
To get the Catholic Church to reveal not only their personnel files from diocese to diocese, other religious orders, or the archdiocese, but the secret files, the 489 files, as they're known in canon law. That's the file that is kept under lock and key by the Archbishop or the bishop. And he is the only one who has access to those files. And that's where all the information is that the church doesn't want you to know, that it doesn't want you to have. That's where they have records of pedophile priests being treated. That's where they have records of supervisors knowing of the treatment but not wanting the public. That's where they have records of the crime, not only of sexual abuse, but of complicity. Those files have to be released from diocese to diocese because it will allow victims to try to heal and gain a degree of closure and validation. It also reveals the crimes. And the Catholic Church does not want to reveal those files. It took me 3.5 years in the 90s in the Gagan litigation to get to those secret files. And when I did, it showed that Bernard Cardinal Law knew that Father Gagan had been sexually abusing children and had been in treatment centers, but was yet transferred to another church without Cardinal Law warning the public. It tells of that evil, that immorality, that criminality.
Has the Catholic Church offered any explanation for not disclosing the file publicly? Have they offered any rationale?
Well, they try to hide under First Amendment grounds. They try to say that the government cannot, through the courts, get involved in church activities through the First Amendment, freedom of religion, the Establishment Clause. But the distinction that has come around in the last 30 or 40 years is the government cannot get involved with religious belief. If you want to believe a pencil is God, that's your business. And government cannot get involved in conduct that is not wrongful. That is, if you want to stand on a chair on your head as part of your worshiping, that's your business. But in the last 30 or 40 years, the courts are now ruling that if the conduct can be shown to be wrongful, then the government can get involved. And that's the law we used, and we used in the 90s in the Gagan cases to reach the secret files, to reach the inner archives of the Catholic Church, so that they couldn't claim that, so that they couldn't hide these secret files.
In terms of the path ahead, I'd mentioned earlier there is a prosecution in the case of Cardinal McCarrick. There's also a civil case that accuses an Opus Dei priest of abuse and misconduct. Where would avenues of accountability that you would like to see reach next?
Well, we need to continue changing the statute of limitations in state to state to state and internationally. For instance, in Haiti, where I represented, more than 150 victims of Douglas Perlitz, who received about a 20-year jail sentence on a plea. He was being supervised by the Order of Malta, Fairfield University, and Father Paul Carrier and the Jesuits. Laws have to be amended so that criminal actions can be brought and civil action can be brought. Unfortunately, under the Constitution, you cannot amend a criminal action retroactively, but with civil claims, you can. So we have to keep changing the laws civilly and criminally so that victims and children are protected. And so the victims can heal, I should say, and children are protected, and the public should be kept, and so the public can be kept aware that these activities are going on and they have to protect their children.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Great questions. Have a good day. Thank you.
You too.